Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week on the Roundup for Wednesday, September 8th, 2021, we're going to be answering 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators the past week. For those of you who are new to the Roundup, we take our stories from this past week's news. We typically will provide those updates in a newsletter format that comes out on Monday mornings in sort of short snippets on our fast takes, on hot takes on some of the issues of the day in these various news stories in both social media and international ed news. And then we go more in depth into 3 of those stories and 3 of those themes here on the Roundup each Wednesday in a live chat format here on Facebook, but also repurposed for our YouTube channel, as well as podcast listening around the globe. So let's take a look at our first question of the day. Is international education simply transactional? Now, this is perhaps a rhetorical question, as if it should be rhetorical. Obviously, international education should never be just transactional. But I think where this concept for this question came from is a recent article in University World News, written from the perspective of the UK, and how a former deputy vice chancellor for international at Coventry University, who had over a period of years saw a 6-fold increase in international recruitment in his 13-year reign. David Pillsbury is his name. He worked at University of Coventry, and he has since left Coventry and has taken on a Chief Development Officer role with London-based Oxford International Education Group. And he's looking back on his time at Coventry and what developments have occurred over the past few years, particularly in British higher education. The question, though, is relevant, I think, for U.S. higher education as well and international education in general, related to the nature of what international educators do, particularly from an institutional level. His fear, from a British perspective, is that it had become largely transactional. Now, what does that mean, transactional, in terms of international ed? It's, well, just getting bums in the seats, as they like to say in the UK, but it's about more. Delivering more, bringing in more revenue, diversifying international populations, reaching a broader range of students abroad. For those British universities that are invested heavily in transnational education through branch campuses and online delivery of their programs, that has been very much seen from this individual's perspective as the transactional nature of international education. So his goal in how he approaches things now and he looks at several factors, including Brexit, EU student recruitment, and how much more difficult, we touched on that in this past week's episode, how much more difficult EU student recruitment has gotten for British universities because of Brexit. We look at other competition for the same students that are marketing their programs in English. And that is something that is changing the dynamic. When 10, 15 years ago, if we would have said China will soon become the number 2 or number 3 largest receiving country of international students, most would have said, you're crazy. How is that even possible? But the reality is they have become the number 3 destination for international students because of their government's emphasis on developing their institutional capacity through their higher education system, developing the programs in English to attract students from around the world as part of their soft power initiative and Belt and Road Initiative programs throughout East, Southeast Asia, South Asia, into Africa, and even into Europe these days. So those programs have made a difference and are changing the dynamic in the competitive landscape for students. And what you see happening, at least from the UK perspective, is that UK institutions are trying to respond to what's happened with COVID, what's happened with Brexit, and how that's changed the dynamic of what they're doing. And that it's part of the concern is, from Dr. Pillsbury's perspective, is that the UK is becoming too expensive, and that they will become priced out of the market. And certainly the EU shift due to Brexit and the expanded tuition fees that they're going to be paying is having a significant impact on EU student recruitment. So it's no longer transactional, can no longer be transactional. There has to be greater value added if you're going to be charging those higher prices. So that's the predicament that British universities certainly find themselves in. And once we're seeing that we're with the transactional nature of what international ed had become, at least from the UK perspective, when particularly the transnational education, where it's just a delivery mechanism, it's not customized for necessarily that audience in the various countries that they're talking about. So you see a lot of challenges here in terms of that continual churn without necessarily that added value. So we'll see what happens with this, but I think we look at it from a U.S. perspective. Certainly, what happened with COVID affected institutions all over the world. Some U.S. schools did it better than others. Some were still able to maintain their in-person curriculum and instruction throughout last year, with some significant health and safety restrictions in terms of class sizes, more suited towards smaller liberal arts colleges and universities that had the smaller classrooms to begin with and weren't constrained with having to go virtual for a number of large classes, which frankly don't exist on smaller campuses to the extent that they do on large state institutions. So we see the changes that have occurred in the U.S. perhaps not as significantly impacted. There hasn't been a Brexit, but there certainly were 4 years of Trump that had negative implications on student flows. There were institutions that realized we have to be much more proactive in our approach. We have to show much greater value. And I think, as we'll talk about later in our third question of the day, we talk about deliverables and outcomes, that those become much more important in the student journey. And that's something we'll see how this concept of transactional education as a hopefully a passing fad. Let's hope it becomes that, and that we approach things, as Dr. Pillsbury says, from a more customizable format, that those programs that are offered abroad are programs that are needed in country, that when you do transnational education, not just for the sake of expanding the range of your degrees, but do it with an intended purpose that helps those local populations develop the skill sets that they need to improve. So I think there's a lot that really makes sense in moving away from a transactional nature of higher education, international higher education. There was another story this past week, we may cover it next week, about Australia, number of higher profile organizations in Australia that frankly have always put the financial benefits of international education as the number one reason for doing it. That's all most people ever hear about why Australian universities recruit internationally, is because of the financial impact it has on our country and their institutions. I think there's moves in Australian higher international ed circles beyond just those international educators who certainly know the value beyond just the financial, but you see international associations within Australia really getting on board with the idea that we in the U.S. certainly reflect well in terms of the public greater mutual understanding that occurs by having international students on campus, the broadening of the context and the conversation that goes on related to certain issues of the day. So there's also a real move, I think, in terms of moving away from just the financial to seeing international education as a much more culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive tool that can be used to broaden relationships, strengthen bonds, and that's something that is only positive for the world we live in. So we'll keep this as a theme. I think we'll see occurring over the years to come with how international education responds to kind of challenges in the world that change the dynamics and make the customization, the specialization of what institutions do abroad much more focused, rather than and appropriate for the audiences that they're seeking. So that's it for question one. Let's shift gears to our second question of the day. And this is a very topical one, and it's one that's received a lot of attention in the press as class resumes on college campuses here in the U.S. And the question is, why will international students not come to the U.S. this fall? And there's a couple of articles recently that touched on this topic. And that's one in particular in Bloomberg this past week suggested that foreign students begin U.S. college deferrals as Delta spreads. And this is something that comes in light of the backdrop of, as they always trot out the stats, 1 million plus international students a year typically come to the U.S., and also the state senator, State Department visa expedition help. And that certainly is part of what I say. This particular article kind of misrepresents in terms of why I think international students are deferring again this fall. Certainly not in the massive numbers that they did this past year, where in 2020, fall 2020, you saw up to 40% plus deferral rates for some institutions. And that's certainly something that would have been unheard of a couple, 3 years ago. So the opening paragraph does mention Delta variants of COVID-19 spreading across the U.S. Some colleges are seeing a pickup in deferrals from international students as a worsening public health situation adds uncertainty for those already struggling to secure flights and visas. And I think that's something that the broader context of health challenges in the United States is always something that the press will glom onto and frankly make a meal out of more than it probably is. Similarly with COVID-19 last fall, those students that were looking to come to the United States still wanted to come, and they're doing everything they could, going to third countries before they could enter the United States. You saw students go to extraordinary lengths because frankly they're in touch with the universities that they want to attend, and they have an idea of what's going to be happening on campus. Campuses are hopefully communicating well what the situation is on campus in terms of what will be expected of them once they arrive, what the classroom situation would be, what living circumstances will be, whether quarantine's required, all of these other variables that were essential last year. So there were still students who came, and they did whatever they could to get here. This year, I think you see those that couldn't come last year, plus those that have applied this year and want to come, all trying to get in at the same time. And the volume that you're seeing in China and India, that's taken us back to pre-pandemic levels, record levels in India, in terms of number of visas that were awarded for this year, 2021. It really shares how significant the desire is to get here. And I think to throw Delta into, well, it's happening in the United States, so so that's going to be pushing students away. Well, it's happening all over the world. It's not just happening in the United States. Is the U.S. doing a particularly good job of containing it through lockdowns and other measures? Certainly not. But I think it's a different world than it was a year ago. For those that have been able to get vaccinated. Students that maybe international students that maybe have not been able to get vaccinated in their home country know that shortly after they get to campus, if their campus doesn't already require it as a prerequisite to start studies in person, they certainly know that they will be able to get the vaccine within short order after their arrival. And in so doing, they would get a vaccine for COVID months in advance of when they might have been able to do so if they were still in their home country. So I don't think using Delta variant, unless you're a student that has compromised immune system and other things that would prevent you from traveling in a global pandemic anyway. I think the greater majority of students that are wanting to come are doing everything in their power to get here. It's not a result of, they hear bad news about the United States. There's something bad in the news every day if you listen to it all and believe it all in terms of the impact that it has on students. The clear challenge this year is a practical one: flights and visas. And that is something that, setting aside the vaccine piece, unless it's a prerequisite to even come to the United States, which it is not yet for travelers and certainly not for students, all you need before coming to the United States right now is a negative COVID test 3 days before departure. And then once you're here, as we talked about, international students, once they get to campus, will be able to get the vaccine shortly, either the one-shot Johnson & Johnson or the two-shot Moderna or Pfizer vaccines in the course of a month's time, and then be fully able to enter the classroom without limits other than potentially masking, which may still be required in social distancing. So those things can happen and will happen and are happening as we speak on college campuses. So I think where the challenges will be are in flights. We've heard about the lack of flights, international flights being a challenge. Students making some supreme sacrifices by having to go to a third country before and to quarantine before they come, which isn't necessarily required here, but it may be required for college campus. They may have to quarantine again once they get to the United States, depending on what the individual campus's requirements are. CDC is requiring a 5 or 10 day quarantine after arrival. If you've been vaccinated, not required, but a negative test would be required. But those are things that are in place that can facilitate the transitions to university life here in the U.S. now. The challenge really is on getting a flight, but also before that, getting the visa to allow them to come to the United States. And that has been outside of China and India. We hear the good news coming out of those two countries, but we really haven't seen that for a wider range of countries, and not necessarily top sending markets, but other markets that do send students regularly. In the UAE, consulates still closed even for emergency appointments. We saw that a couple weeks ago, and we saw another factor that was put out last week that only 40% of consulates are open for business when it comes to student visas. So that's not great for a world that really wants to be here. So numbers from outside of China and India will likely suffer for this fall, and we won't see that until November 2022 Open Doors data. But we'll get a sense of that from SEVIS by the numbers when they do their report, hopefully later this fall. So we'll keep our eyes open for that report, and we'll cover that here in depth, obviously, when that becomes available. So the real question of why will students not come? I don't think it's going to be heavily dependent on the Delta variant blow-ups in certain parts of the country. It's going to be because they couldn't get a visa or they couldn't get a flight. So those are the real challenges I think international students are facing getting here this fall. But early indications are, and we'll cover some of the successes that some institutions are seeing in new international enrollments. We'll cover that in next week's Roundup as well as in the newsletter. But there's certainly a lot more positives, I think, coming this fall than most would hope, and most are pleasantly surprised so far. But we'll see what happens in terms of what the future might bring for international education here in the United States. But I think it's certainly going to be well above where we were last fall. Not probably back to pre-pandemic normals in terms of overall enrollments this fall, but certainly on a definite upward trajectory that can be added to in January and certainly fall 2022. So let's get to our third and final question of the day. This is one that I'll be talking about more in an upcoming series I'll be doing for IDP Connect on what I'm calling CPR. that will be an interesting, it's Content Priorities Revisited, CPR, and we'll be talking about a variety of topics that the pandemic, the changing nature of international education are forcing institutions to adjust how they message themselves to prospective audiences. So we'll talk about that, but in an upcoming series, the CPR series I'll be doing. But I want to get to the question: how important are outcomes for international students? Because that'll be one of the key things I'll be sharing in this first messages in this series, and that's on just how much we need as institutions to be, for our international audiences as well as domestic, but this is what we talk about here is international ed, how much we need to focus on sharing the positive stories, the positive outcomes, the job placement rates for international students. Now, this is one thing that every college and university has their own career services office or some variation of that name, but so very few actively track their international students, graduates, and job placements. They'll have overall numbers for what percentage of students get jobs within the first 6 months of graduation, and those can be used in general conversations about outcomes. But really, when it comes to international audiences, because they have different set of rules in terms of what's allowed for them after they're done with their field of study. They can only work in the United States in their field of study for 1 to 3 years, depending on the program after they graduate. So this is something that we really should be honing in on in our messaging. And why does it matter to an undergraduate student who's 17, 18 years old to know what the outcomes are going to be for them? Because if not for them, their parents certainly will want to know why they're going to be dropping $160,000 to $250,000 for 4 years for their son or daughter to come to your school. Not just to get a degree, that's fine. Not just for the experience, that's great too. But they want to be able to know it's going to land them that job or that access to graduate education or preparing them for a career back home. Whatever it is, they have to feel comfortable knowing that that outcome is fairly well assured if they come to your institution. So how important is it? And we'll talk about that. For those that have been in international ed for a few years, you might have heard of the iGraduate International Student Barometer, the ISB, and that comes out every year around this time in the fall. And it shows a cross-section, not just for the U.S., for globally mobile students, and has some really fantastic data sets in it that I think will be very useful as you try and assess what the needs are of your prospective student audiences. And that's something the survey has had regularly has millions of student participants this year, had feedback from over 4 million students. So it's the most comprehensive kind of student, prospective student and student survey that I've seen. The most significant piece, and they break it down by region, if not country, for the factors. But one of the things that becomes quite clear is for the top five criteria for prospective students that are determining where they go. One of the lines in the survey or in the narrative of the report is, it seems safe to say employability outcomes matter for students. Given an increase in the importance of employability for today's college graduates, international student recruitment has seen a growing emphasis on return on investment, making employability not just important for students, but also for higher education institutions. Employability attracts, it supports its students. Employability attracts, it supports students' happiness, and helps integrate domestic and international students. It also matters for recommendation, turning graduates into brand ambassadors and brand ambassador alumni. So a couple of concepts that I'm very keen on including in communication plans is sharing those success stories, having your graduates, your successful international alum, become your ambassadors. for your institution and be a part of your marketing efforts. So, but of the top 5 decision factors for students in terms of where what they put the most weight on, future career ranked top at over 95%, it looks like. Institutional reputation, about 94%. Earning potential, 95%. 93%, excuse me. Country reputation, 92%. Specific course title, 91%. So those are significant numbers. Obviously, those are the five most important factors influencing enrollment decisions on enrollment. 2 of those are very specific to employability and outcomes. So this is again a global strategy or global survey for the International Student Barometer. And it really, it's a great data set to get a hold of and just get your heads around some of the key issues of the day. This also, for each region, they do a post-COVID and pre-COVID analysis on how institutions did during the COVID times. You see the content of programs. You see preparing students for the global world of work as an important piece. So some really fascinating data. I always recommend getting head around these kind of issues because it helps keeps your finger on the pulse, so to speak, what's happening out there in the market and what institutions need to be particularly sensitive to when they are putting their messaging together for institutions. So this will be the first piece of what I'll be talking about in this new series of content, Priorities Revisited. That's going to look at outcomes. It's going to look at emergency management kind of messaging. It's going to look at value. It's going to look at a number of different topics, including telling your COVID stories well, as well as safety and what that looks like on your campus. Those are the priorities I think we'll see some tweaks on, or should see some tweaks in terms of how institutions are positioning themselves in reference to prospective students. On this same note, related to outcomes, another survey, smaller one by Into, came out this past week about Gen Z career aspirations. So we're talking about Gen Z, the generation born after the millennium, that are basically the first completely digital natives. That's in terms of how they were born and grew up with technology and such. That you see this Into survey has shared that the impact of COVID has radically changed the attitudes and career aspirations of Gen Z. This is according to Olivia Streetfeld, the CEO of Into. And it says that this change will come to define the world of higher education and work. It's absolutely critical that governments, universities, and industry are primed for this shift among young people to support a whole generation that is eager to learn and work differently. Of the 55% that report their career aspirations have changed, 29% indicated their aspirations have changed a little, while 26% indicated they had changed a lot. Interestingly, over 76% said that they want to work overseas one day. So these are students that are going overseas to study. 76% are saying they may also want to work overseas as well. So I think this is important and encouraging for universities that can promote their programs accordingly in terms of the ability for students to work after they're done with their degree. And that's where tracking that data is going to be so important. We'll talk in the series I mentioned earlier, we'll talk about some of the ways you can be doing that, even if Career Services doesn't have international student-specific data, how you can be capturing those numbers that will help you make the case. So of all the students that were surveyed in this Into survey, Indian students are the most optimistic, with 94% saying they have a positive outlook on their future. Over 4 in 10 respondents said they wanted to become entrepreneurs and start their own businesses. Very important to keep that in mind. And some 88% they consider reaching the top of their profession or goal one day. So these are strivers. These are students today that are really seeking the top. But they know that the pandemic has changed things, changed the world, and there are students that are changing the career interests as a result. So that is something that we want to, institutions need to be responsive in terms of how they talk about themselves, talk about how their careers prepare students, how their education prepares students for the jobs of the future, that type of thing. So it's really important, I think, in the survey, and certainly the iGraduate International Student Barometer certainly reflect as well, that while there's change afoot in terms of what students might be wanting to study or what the impact that they want their degree to have on them and the world, that they're looking for, that they believe that their overseas study experience will help them train for a specific career, 84%. 83% agreed overseas education offers a competitive advantage, career advantage. And 76% said they want to work overseas one day, which we've covered. So I think there's a lot of hope here in terms of what you can be focusing on in terms of your messaging. And you look also with that Gen Z survey from Into, so one of the data points was there's a good number of international students, prospective international students, that want to start their own business, become entrepreneurs. And in the U.S., that's something we pride ourselves on. We look at the CEOs of the tech startups of the last 20 years, and almost half of them have been former international students. But we look at our process in the United States, and we realize it's not really set up to encourage those sort of entrepreneurs and student and immigrant entrepreneurs. There's an article from MarketWatch that talks about the U.S. needs this job-creating visa option for immigrant entrepreneurs, saying that existing visa options are impractical and often inaccessible for those wishing to start companies. So this is certainly something I certainly would support, is a need to change change the restrictions or open up a category that's beyond H-1B, which really doesn't allow that entrepreneurship to develop, because you have to work for a company, or if you become an entrepreneur while you're there, there's other challenges like that. So there's something called the LIKE Act, Let Immigrants Kickstart Employment, where this Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren from California, I think, that would create a new temporary visa option and open a pathway to a green card and permanent residency for foreign-born entrepreneurs who bring promising startups to the U.S. This is also something I think international students could fit into, because you see that the real value of these startups is that they also provide jobs. There's an interesting stat here. According to the Kaufman Foundation, by creating just 75,000 startup visas, more than 1.6 million new jobs could be created over a 10-year period. So there's obviously, Canada and Japan have a formal startup visa program, so other countries are already doing something similar, so we're behind on that front. There's an EB visa that's for like a financial investment visa, but it's really not practical for most potential entrepreneurs. They're just starting up. But it's something that certainly is worth considering, and certainly I think there's value in this. But that's all we have for today on the Roundup. We thank you for making us a part of your weekly international edification, and we look forward to covering more topics like these in the weeks to come. Have a great day. Cheers.